Hello, I'm very excited to discuss with you some of the implications of research on organizational responses to adversity, and in particular, the great body of research that has been done in management sciences on resilience and how we cope with adversity in organizations, and especially when there are these massive institutional shocks which we are experiencing right now. So today I just want to spend a few minutes talking to you briefly about some of the key insights that have come from the research that myself and many others have done, and talk about how that might influence some of the decisions we make within organizations. So first of all, as a reference point, conducted a study that was published in 2017 with a number of colleagues, as you can see here on the screen, in trying to understand what has been researched up to this point on the topic of organizational responses to adversity, and in particular trying to better explain what is an actual crisis and how that is defined seems to really impact responses, as well as what is this notion of resilience. And so I'll talk a little bit about that today. It's kind of a primer, but this is the extensive article that we wrote on this topic. As we think about resilience to adversity, we really hear about this term everywhere. We hear about it in practitioner literature, we hear about it in academic literature, and everywhere in between. And we try to understand, why do we see some forms of resilience? If you see in this picture, one of the trees clinging to the mountaintop, to the mountainside, surviving despite obstacles. And then on the bottom picture, a tree that just literally fell over as I was out walking one day, kind of freaked me out right on the trail, right behind me. And so we see this all over in the literature. We read about weathering the storm, business resilience. We hear about this in terms of personal resilience and growth despite difficulties. And so this is a topic that's frequently discussed and yet is not all that well understood in a lot of different cases. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about what we learned about crises, resilience, and organizing, discuss some models that might be helpful, and then kind of summarize some key points to focus on. One of the key things that we found is that there are two really different perspectives on understanding the notion of a crisis. One is that a crisis can be a singular event. And so this is unexpected, there's a jolt, it's low probability, high impact. And so we know these kinds of things happen. So think natural disasters that just happen. And yet one of the challenges about looking at crises as unique, surprising, unexpected types of events is that how do we generate kind of a cohesive approach to managing crises? If no two crises are considered to be the same, this presents some challenges for organizations as we try and think about that. So there's another perspective which looks at a crisis as a process. So in this perspective, challenges, kind of these punctuated events that might emerge, are the result of this gestation of negative aspects. And so we have a number of negative aspects that are gestated over time, and then suddenly we have this kind of big event, and yet it didn't come from just nowhere in most cases. And so this notion of crisis as a process, especially as it relates to organizations, means that crisis actually occurs over time. There's drift, there's incubation of the crisis, and then there's this cumulative process, and then there's a resolution. So there is a post-crisis kind of aftermath. And so looking at these in different ways really helps shape how we might think about what an organization can do, both in a quote-unquote non-crisis moment, and considering, are we drifting, are we incubating a crisis, but then also trying to think about, well, what is it that we can do to prepare for these kind of black swan unexpected events? When we think about resilience as well, there's some similar variants in terms of how we define this. So for some, resilience is being able to bounce back or jump back, and this is really anchored in engineering literature about materials. And so a physical material that will bend and then return to its former position. This is not how it is viewed in much of the psychology literature, which instead says resilience is the maintenance of functioning despite the adversity. So this wouldn't be a bend but not break. This would be simply a maintenance of functioning. And much of the research in psychology suggests that this is the norm rather than the exception. Similar, we see in multi-level and organization system resilience, kind of a similar combination to this, bouncing back, being able to have the capacity to manage surprises, and importantly, recognizes that resilience is kind of interrelated between different levels of analysis. We might have community resilience, organization level resilience, and individual, and these are going to impact one another. And so the way we define resilience is a process by which an actor builds and uses its capability endowments to interact with the environment in a way that positively adjusts and maintains functioning prior to, during, and following adversity. And so you can see that in this definition, it does suggest that there are multiple stages of developing resilience, both prior to, during, and following a challenging event, and that it's this capability, developing endowments of resources and other capabilities to be able to effectively manage those situations. So kind of also just showing some definitions of resilience, of crises. I'm not going to talk about this in detail. There's a lot here, but we found that depending on how we view crisis as either a process or just an event, that then influences what we talk about in terms of crisis management. So that would be the back end of what I've just been discussing in terms of resilience, which is the follow-up of these challenging events or dealing with these. In terms of what is it exactly does it mean to manage a crisis. So if it's a process, then we would think about the entire stage, the incubation of the crisis through to the punctuated event to the aftermath. But if it's just a crisis as a unique event, we mostly think about, well, how do we respond, readjust our assumptions, and then enact kind of a new normal in the aftermath of these situations. And so really, I think one of the reasons I'm emphasizing this point so emphatically is really trying to understand the notion of a crisis and what we are actually dealing with can help us to better understand how leaders can make decisions given the situations that they are facing. All right, so some insights on this, and so trying to build up to how does this actually impact decision makers. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of the models that we found and talk really briefly about those, and then get to kind of the summative points that I'm trying to make. So first of all, and this is borrowing from the literature, or the psychology literature on resilience, this highlights that we see different pathways of response to adversity. So this could be, again, in using our two different definitions of crisis, this could be these punctuated events. Somebody might follow a path of resilience, so their functioning is maintained relatively stable. And this could be both individual, you would argue as well for an organizational. You might manage it well and then get misaligned. It might be disrupted initially and then have this restorative or recovery-based path. Or there could just be chronic misalignment in facing these types of challenges. And so recognizing where your organization is and where your workforce is, and that, again, the psychology literature would suggest that individually, most people are going to be on this path of resilience. And then many others are going to be on this kind of restorative path. And then a few are going to be in the chronic misalignment as well as the delayed misalignment, but those are still going to be potential issues. When there are these kind of major discontinuities, and this is showing, again, the previous was kind of daily perturbations that are kind of these incubated crises and that accumulate, and then we might have this punctuated event. And again, we see similar paths in terms of responses to these challenges. And so this is, again, very useful as we try and think about, well, where are we actually at? As we look at the environment and the challenges that are in the environment, we might initially just assume we've lost all of our resources and all of our capabilities, but the truth of the matter is that the vast majority of individuals are going to be resilient and capable despite being potentially victims of the challenging circumstances. They are going to be very capable of helping to provide solutions. They are in the front lines and the most capable of recognizing what is it that we need to do and how can we employ that. And so as leaders, recognizing that those that are around you are the solution to the challenge and is very helpful in trying to think about how you can draw upon those who are facing the challenges directly to develop impactful solutions. All right, the final images I want to show is just a model that we developed to try and think about the interaction between resilience and the types of adversity. And so again, we label these routine hardships, daily or weekly or monthly challenging events that are indeed threatening an organization over the long term. And so in terms of the resilience development, there's organizing and adjusting, making changes based off of the feedback getting from the environment, preparing, managing risks, restoring key features of the organization, but then also developing cognitive, behavioral, emotional, relational resources, endowments for the organization to again develop that resilience. But as we know, it's not just routine hardships. There might be a discontinuous event, could be the result of a series of these routines over time, or it could just be a surprise external event that is causing it. And this is where we have some of these resources within the organization and within individuals to respond to these major disturbances. And so as organizational leaders, we try and think about, well, how can we develop these endowments within our organization to be prepared for this? And then how can those kind of regular events of preparing and managing challenges then be drawn upon when we have a major disturbance? And so it is important to try and think about some of the positive and challenging outcomes that can come from a disruption within an organization and within a broader context. As we're seeing now with COVID-19 and many other challenges that are going on, we're seeing these discontinuous events that are forcing many organizations to pivot. And so this organizing and adjusting is in many cases happening on a major scale for a lot of different industries as they were trying to think about how do we pivot given these changes that may in fact cause long-term cultural shifts. So in conclusion, what is it that we can do as decision makers given some of this knowledge? Well, first of all is recognizing that resilience and crises are related in terms of both notions of crisis that I've discussed today, both crisis as an event and crisis as a process. And so it is important for organizational leaders to recognize how do we build the type of resilience within our system that can help us get back on track when we're facing these daily challenges, but then also how can we develop the endowments for our organization so that when something discontinuous and extremely surprising happens, how can we respond in a way that benefits our organization? And again, so the capabilities for resilience, it's interactive in conjunction with rather than isolation from a crisis. So the endowments that we choose to develop within our organizations are going to be influenced by crises that have happened in the past and things we are anticipating in the future. And so we're not just trying to think about what is it that we want to develop in complete isolation of everything else. And so leaders need to prepare for both the incubation of crises and how to respond in a resilient way, develop capabilities for durability, but then also these discontinuous events. And so processes of organizing and adjusting to shift capabilities. So I think that as we face this post-COVID-19 and while we're continuing to be in this crisis, organizations should really be thinking about how do we pivot what we have, how do we deploy, especially those employees who are in the front lines, who are in many ways victims of this crisis, how do we deploy them as sources of the solutions for what we can do moving forward, and recognizing that despite the major disruption that this is, that those who are disrupted, those who are victims of this challenge are in fact some of the best to provide solutions. So with that, thank you for your time today, and hope to continue learning about this topic with many of you who are interested in these same things. And thank you very much for your time and attention.